Okay, the Seder.
I tell you, when Rabbi Goldwich gave the shiur, it was the same thing. He also had little babies on his arm.
I wasn't him. It was a different little baby, I think.
A different baby, yes. I assume so.
Okay, very good. Yofi. So, yeah, difficult morning today, but we will carry on and we will learn. And Bezrat Hashem, the learning we have should be for the success of our Chayalim, L'Eloi Nishmat HaNoflim, L'Fat HaPtzuim, etc. Okay, so we are on Daf Yud Bet Amud Bet. Again, we're just picking up, just going through this piece, which we really had done before we took the break of this year, but trying to get back into it again. So we saw the Mishnah yesterday, Machloket Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, right? And we saw, according to Beit Shammai, one should not transport, one should not deliver these matanot keuna, matanot and chala to the Kohen on Yom Tov, whereas Beit Hillel said it's mutar. And we saw there was a distinction. The Mishnah makes a distinction between matanot and chala on the one hand, which are things which you could not necessarily separate before Yom Tov because you may not have had the substance, the chiyuv had not already kicked in yet before Yom Tov, as opposed to truma, which truma could always be separated before Yom Tov, and therefore on Yom Tov itself we would be more strict about that. That was the Mishnah. We saw then three opinions in the Gemara as to what actually the machloket of the Mishnah was talking about. And we saw the first opinion and the last opinion in the Braita really could be compatible with the Mishnah. However, the middle opinion of Rabbi Yossi is certainly not compatible with the Mishnah. Right? Whereas our Mishnah discusses the idea of taking these matanot from the animal, and chala, which Beit Hillel says you can take and Beit Shammai says you can't. But everybody agrees in our Mishnah that truma you cannot take on Yom Tov. Now Rabbi Yossi was the middle opinion, and the Gemara and the Braita says the exact opposite of that. According to Rabbi Yossi, he says that regarding matanot and chala, everybody agrees, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, that you can take to the Kohen on Yom Tov. But when it comes to truma, that's where it gets a little bit trickier. When it comes to truma, that's the machloket. But since this machloket means that he's more lenient because Beit Hillel actually allows it. Beit Hillel allows you even to take truma on Yom Tov to the Kohen, even though you had to separate the truma itself before. So we're now, if we look about, say 12 lines from the bottom, more or less, where we have two dots near the bottom of Yud Bet Amud Bet, says the Gemara, Marav Yodam Mashmuel, Halakha Rabbi Yossi, right? So the halakha follows Rabbi Yossi. Says Rashi over here, a few lines below. Rashi says Halakha Rabbi Yossi, V'aliba de Beit Hillel. Obviously, we go according to Beit Hillel. That even truma, so this is the most lenient opinion we have in terms of this, right? That even truma on Yom Tov you can go and you can take that to the Kohen. That would not be forbidden tircha or anything like that. Again, Beit Shammai would not allow it, but we paskin like Beit Hillel. So we said Amar Yudam Mashma Alachak Rabbi Yossi, Rav Tuvi, brother of Nechemia, Avale Gaba de Chamra de Truma. Now the Gemara tells us a story to back this up. We have Rav Tuvi, the son of Rav Nechemia, who had a certain barrel or a jug of wine, which was truma. Garba de chamra, which is wine, which was truma. Okay, and so he'd obviously already separated it before Yom Tov as truma. Atzal kamed Rav Yosef, Amau maulam tu'el kohen aidna. And he came to Rav Yosef and he said to him, what is, can I now bring, this was on Yom Tov. He said, am I allowed to bring it to the Kohen? Right, Maulam to the Kohen. Now, Rabbi Yossi said, Rabbi Yehuda Mashma said that the halakha is like Rabbi Yossi, and therefore you can. Okay, so we have the halakha, and then we have a Maaseh Rav to prove it. Continues the Gemara, Shpezichne de Rabba Barav Chanan. He had these bundles of mustard seeds. Okay, and again, here they're still in the pods, and they haven't yet been separated. Amarle, we're going to see the question that comes up now is somewhat disconnected, but it's going to lead in to something which we're going to try and use from our discussion as a proof for it. So, Amarle, Maulifruche, Umechal Minayu B'Yom Tov. The question was, could you take these seeds, which are in the pod, could you lifruche, could you sort of crush them or rub them between your fingers in order to get the seeds out of the pod, and then Yom Tov. And then you could eat them on Yom Tov, right? What's the question over here? Says Rashi, Ma'u lefruche, hasharvitin, the pods that have got the seeds inside, ulotzia zera b'Yom Tov, and to take the seeds out on Yom Tov, mishale. Would this be permitted? Mishal b'Yom Tov k'shchita u'kubishul. On the one hand, you say, what's the difference between this and shchita? What's the difference between this and bishul? What's the difference between this and any other melacha of ochel nefesh, which you need in order to prepare the food? That's the one side of it. Or dilma, continues Rashi, or perhaps kevan devsham elav Yom Tov lo the toradat dishau. Say, since you could have done this on erev Yom Tov, maybe you can't do it on Yom Tov. This is a toradah of disha, of threshing. Right? We mentioned yesterday the idea that all the melachot of ochel nefesh, which you're allowed to do on Yom Tov, only in a case where you had no possibility to perform it on erev Yom Tov. Right? So cooking, said, just mentioned yesterday, but I'll mention it again. Very, very important, practical halacha. Although nowadays lots of people don't cook on Yom Tov, but that's for other peripheral reasons, right? If you have the oven or the gas or you have electric things when you're turning it on, so that would be a separate problem. So there are ways of getting around that. If you use a timer, use a Shon Shabbat, or what's called a Chagaz, I think it's called, different technological mechanisms to get your appliances on and off. But in theory, if the appliance is on, there's no problem. Many people like to do a barbecue on Day of Yom Tov, right? There's no problem in terms of cooking. But you could say, as we asked the question yesterday, why don't we say that since you could cook theoretically on erev Yom Tov? Once upon a time, they didn't have fridges and freezers, but nowadays we do. And we said, again, the reason is because you cannot compare freshly cooked food to previously cooked food. You still cannot do it in the same way to get the same effect, and therefore it's allowed. But the question here, everybody agrees that cooking itself on Yom Tov is permitted, but threshing is not. It's one of those melachot. And again, the reason why, even though it is a melacha which is involved in the process of cooking food, it's at a different stage of the process. We generally accept a chalukah, a division as follows, that those melachot which are related to food, which are performed by and large in the house, in the kitchen, right, cooking and baking, which is the same melacha, right, things like that, that could be, that is permitted. But things which are done out in the field, even though they're part of the process of food, right? Plowing, sowing, and planting, and plowing, and harvesting, and threshing, etc. Those are melachot which are not performed in the home. Those are melachot which are generally performed in the field. They are done for a much longer period, for much greater quantities, much longer time period, and that is not considered immediate ochel nefesh. So those melachot are not allowed. So that's the question over here. If you were to come and to do this, to remove these seeds, right, to crush these pods and take these seeds out for eating, do we say, well, that's ochel nefesh? Or do we say, no, that's considered like disha, that's considered like those melachot, even though they're for ochel nefesh, which are not allowed? Okay, so that was the question. Now, evidently it was a good question. It says, right, ushpidichne de Rabba bar Rav Chanan, Abba Yasret de Chadra, Marle Ma'u lefruche u'meicham minayu, Yas Rabba bar Rav Chanan, he didn't know the answer. So I say, evidently, it's a good question. He didn't know the answer. It was a little bit tricky. So, they came to Rava, and they asked Rava, what do you say? So Rava says as follows: Molelin melilot umafrechin kitniot b'yom tov. Rava says this would be mutar. This would be permitted, right? And he gives two illustrations. One is molelin melilot, and one is mafrechin kitniot. So molin melilot, this is kind of if you have sheaves of wheat, and you would take them again, and you sort of rub them between your fingers to get the stalk out. And also mafrechin kitniot, the same thing where you separate these seeds from the pods. These actions would be, in order to eat them, that would be permitted on Yom Tov. That's what Rava says. Now Itvei Abaye says, hang on a minute, Rava. I'll give you a proof that that's not so simple. He says, Hamolel melilot me'ev Shabbat lemachar, menapeach miyad liyad, ve'ochel, אבל לא בקנון ולא בתמחוי. המולע מלילות מערב יום טוב למחר, מנפח על יד, ואוכל מנפח sorry, ואפילו בקנון, אפילו בתמחוי, אבל לא בטבלה, ולא בנפה, ולא בכפלה. Okay, so he brings our brayta, which says as follows. It says, okay, there are two stages in each of these. We're dealing with both, I guess, melilot and kitniot. Again, you have these sheaves of wheat, and instead of doing it in the altogether the industrial sort of way, you just hold them in your hand, and they're a little bit soft, so you rub them together in your hand to get the sheaves, to get to that edible part, right? But there are two stages to this. One is separating it from the hard outer casing, and the second thing is then you're going to have in your hand, or wherever you do it, you're going to have the edible part and you're going to have the non-edible part together, and then you still need to separate them. So it says Abai, he quotes the Braita like this: Erev Shabbat lemachar. Sorry, Erev Shabbat. If you were to do this on Erev Shabbat, so now you've got this mixture, right? And you still need to take the edible part away from that. You've separated it, but now you need to take each part. So he says, if you do this on Erev Shabbat, lemachar, the next day, i.e. on Shabbat, menapeach miyad liyad ve'ochel. You can sort of blow from one hand to the other, i.e. you are separating it now in a way that is a little bit unusual. So it's not the standard way of separating, and therefore you could do that on Shabbat in order to eat. Right, menapeach is like maybe you're sort of throwing it up. Menapeach miyad liyad, right? So you're taking it and you're throwing it up from one hand to the other in order to kind of cause the bigger parts and the smaller parts to separate from one another. Aval lo b'kanon v'lo b'tamchoi. Kanon and tamchoi are different types of implements which you would use to sort. So you cannot use it with a kli. Same way that we know when it comes to the halachot, this is going to be similar to the halacha of borer. Borer, which is the malacha of sorting on Shabbat. Shabbat borer is one of the very, very practical, a lot of practical shaylas come up regarding borer with eating and all sorts of things like that. So you are not allowed to separate. In order to separate on Shabbat, the Gemara says there are three conditions which need to be met. One is that it needs to be, you have to take ochel from solet and not solet from ochel. So you have a mixture of two different foods, or food and skin, or food and bones, or whatever it is. And there's one that you want and one that you don't want. So you're allowed to take that which you want, as opposed to taking that which you don't want to put away. So that's called ochel from solet. You take the food from the waste and not the other way around. The second condition is that it has to be la'altar. It has to be if one is taking the food away because I want it now. I can't take it away to use it later. Okay, big discussion in the poskim. What exactly does la'altar mean? Does that mean if I'm sort of preparing the food, preparing the salad a little bit an hour before the meal, is that considered la'altar because it's the next meal or because it's immediate? Okay, and the third condition, which is what relates to Agmaraya, is that it needs to be beyad v'lo b'kli. It needs to be with your hand and not with a specialized tool. Okay, the Gemara says that all three, when you have all three of these conditions, so then that is called derech achila, and that is not called derech breira. That's the way that people eat. It's not the way that people sort. You're allowed to eat. You're allowed to take it out in such a way that you can eat it, but you're not allowed to go and sort it. Just that when we talk about bayad v'lo b'kli, so it has to be with a hand and not with an implement, right? So we mean a specialized instrument for sorting, a sieve or something like that. Knife and fork, ordinary cutlery, which a person uses to eat, that is not considered a kli. That is considered an extension of one's hand. People don't have an extension of the hand and they just use their hand. But that's if you have the cutlery, that is considered extension of your hand in that sense, and that would be okay. So over here, again, so we're talking about molim melilot. Says the Braita that you can, if you did it on Erev Shabbat, so now on Shabbat, menapeach miyad liyad ve'ochel, aval lo b'kano v'lo b'tamchei. You can't use one of these kelim. But the point is, you see over there that it's hamolam melilot me'erev Shabbat. Okay, it doesn't say that you could be molam melilot on Shabbat, because that is going to be forbidden. Okay, same thing when it comes to Yom Tov. Hamolam melilot me'erev Yom Tov, lemachar menapeach al yad ve'ochel afilu b'kano v'afilu b'tamchei. But even these kelim, which you could not use on Shabbat, you can use on Yom Tov to sort. Okay, borer is one of those menachot, which, as we can see in certain instances, it's going to be permitted on Yom Tov. However, okay, even on Yom Tov, there is a restriction on certain kelim These are implements which are used to sort much larger quantities, and therefore those you'd not be allowed to use as well. But so what's the proof from the Braita? The proof of Abai is as follows. We started off with a question, right? We said, could you separate these seeds from the pods on Yom Tov? Is that considered ochel nefesh, or is that considered a forbidden melacha? And we said, and Rava said, yes, you can do it. Abai said, what do you mean? We have your proof. Because over Yahweh, the Gemara, where we discuss Molel Melilot, we talk about doing it Me'erev Yom Tov. For our purposes, Molel Melilot and Afruche Kidniot is essentially one and the same. So he says, yeah, you could do it from Erev Shabbat, and you could do it from Erev Yom Tov. But the fact you could do it from Erev Yom Tov seems to imply what? Continues the Gemara, Me'erev Yom Tov in, but Yom Tov lo. You can do it on Erev Yom Tov, but on Yom Tov itself, you cannot. So that is Abaye's challenge to Rava, who says this would be permitted even on Yom Tov. So now says the Gemara, no, it could be that even on Yom Tov itself, it is still permitted. So then how do we explain what we just said? He says, Shabbat, Yom Tov. Okay, just like it said at the beginning of the right, that said Erev Shabbat, and it had to say Erev Shabbat because clearly you can't perform this on Shabbat itself. So it says Erev Shabbat in the Reisha, so it says Erev Yom Tov in the Seifa. But it's Einachinami, you could do it on Yom Tov, you could do it itself as well. Okay, so that's the so you could say yes, you could say no. That's the Machloket Abaye and Rava. Now, why did we bring all of this? Because remember, we started off. Our discussion was that Truma is going to be different from Matnot Kona and to Chala, because Matnot Kona and Chala you could separate on Yom Tov, whereas Truma you can't separate on Yom Tov because you can always separate the Truma. The obligation always kicks in before Yom Tov. But based on what we've just said, if all of this is correct, says the Gemara, can Matzinu Truma shezakai baramatan. We've just established a case whereby you can and you would be required to separate Truma on Yom Tov itself. How so? Says Rashi, Ken, the Molelin Melilot Yom Tov. If you say that this idea of Molelin Melilot, of again softening these stalks, of rubbing them in your hand in order to eat them on Yom Tov, if you could do that on Yom Tov itself, well then, Matzino Truma shezakai b'amata. This is our case where you could separate Truma on Yom Tov. The stam shibulin lo mafrishin Truma ad she'asu dagan. Okay, when does the obligation to separate Trumot and Masrot kick in? The obligation to when essentially the food becomes teva, when you have to separate Trumot and Masrot, is from the time she'asu dagan. When you have completed processing that produce, whatever it is. In the case of grain, it's when it's become dagan, when it's been harvested, or when it's been put together in these bundles. That is when it's from that point is when you have to separate truma. So when you still have these stalks, they don't have an obligation of truma yet. However, if you are now molelan beyom tov leochlan, you're not going to complete the process. You're not going to do all the malacha that's involved and process it together in bundles of wheat, but rather you're going to eat the stalks by themselves one on one. Well, when you eat it, that is now it's gemar malacha, that you've now finished processing the stalk in the way that you're going to eat it, and therefore you would now have to separate truma. So if you can, if you can do this molam melilot on Yom Tov, that would be a case where just before you eat it, you now have to separate truma, and that's a problem because that contradicts our Mishnah. So we said in the last line of the Gemara, Tanan, lo imamati b'truma sheno zakai b'aramatach. So once is the Gemara lo kasha, actually it is, will surprise you all to hear, that it's a machloket. Ha Rabbi v'ha Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. Okay, so there are two opinions over here regarding when one would perform this molam melilot and eat these sporadically, eat these wheat grains. Would one be required to separate truma from it or not? Would one be required to separate truma from it or not? Ha Rabbi v'ha Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, we're now on the top of Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. And now we're going to explain what exactly is the machloket between them. Titania, hichnish shibolin lasot menisa, ochel men arai, upatur upatur. Lemolelan b'mlilot, Rabbi Mechayev, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda poter. Okay, so what's the case? If one brought in shibolim, one brought in wheat into their house, Lasot menisa, you're going to use it, you're going to turn it into wheat and turn it into flour and make a dough from it. So in such a case, i.e., the intention is to, by the way, it's amazing how to see with all of these halachot, how much the intention that you have, what you plan to do with the grain, that is going to change its halachic status. Right? It's the same grain. It's exactly the same situation. Nothing's changed. The only thing that's changed is what do I intend to do with it? What do I have in mind? And what I have in mind completely changes. What the halachic status, it could be tevel, it could be chayv in truma, it could be patur, right? All of that is the power of thought in this halakha and in many other halachot as well. So the point is that if you're bringing in and you're going to eat it in the normal way, so when you eat it in the normal way and you process all the grains, so that's when you would need to separate truma. However, that's only for achilat keva. The halacha is that all that we've said, that when you have to separate, you can't. It's considered tevel, and you cannot eat it before. You cannot eat it before you've processed it, before you've separated truma. That is only to eat it properly as part of a whole meal. However, there is a din of what's called achilat arai, to eat sporadically, to take one of the grains and just chew on it, right, as a snack. That would be permitted even before you've separated the truma. But where would that be permitted? So that's our case. You brought in these grains, you're going to process them normally, right? One could, everybody agrees on this part, that one could take, at that point, one could take one of the grains, one could soften it in one's hand, one could chew on it, and that would be fine. That's not considered tevel. That's achilat arai, and that's patur. Because ultimately, I've not yet reached the stage of the gmar malacha. However, second case, and this is where we're going to have the machloket. Lemolaran b'mlilot, i.e., you brought in all these grains. Why? For the purpose of snacking on them. Meaning that's the only way you're going to eat them. No one is going to process them and put them in bundles and turn them into wheat. No one's going and turn them into flour. No one's going to do that. This is out. So do I say that at this stage already, once I bring them into the house, that is considered the gemar malacha? So according to Rabbi, yes, right? So the malam melilot, Rabbi mechayev. According to Rabbi, therefore you would have to separate. You would have to separate trumot and masrot from it. Now that's already reached that stage. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda poter. However, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, he exempts it from it in this case. Why? Because he holds that when it comes to wheat, the only way that I can have gemar malacha is when I turn them, when I am finished processing and pile them in bundles. He learns it out from the fact, I won't go into it now, but you can have a look in Rashi. He learns it out from the fact that it's called dagan. Dagan only relates to when the wheat is processed in this way. And he says if you bring in the wheat and you're going to eat it in a way that it's never going to be dagan, so then it would be completely exempt from truma. Okay, so according to what we've said now, therefore we have a situation, according to Rabbi, where you would be obligated and you'd have to separate the truma on Yom Tov. So according to Rabbi, it is a contradiction according to our Mishnah. Okay, what we said in our Mishnah still stands according to Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, because according to him, there is no situation where you would have to separate the truma on Yom Tov. And now the Gemara says, hang on a second, actually there is. Actually, even for Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, we can find a case. Says the Gemara now, fourth line, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, Nami meshkachat la. You can also find you a case. The case is this. Kagon shechnis shibolin asot menisa. Okay, so you brought in these grains in order to, again, to process them and to eat them in the normal way, to turn it into dough. V'nimlach alein lemolalan. And after that's already been done, after you've already brought it into the house, you now change your mind and you decide, actually, you're just going to snack on them already. Right, b'yom tov. And this is on Yom Tov. So the tavle b'yomei. So he says, according to this case, even Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda will agree. Why? Because when you brought it into the house with the intent of turning it into dagan, so then it became tevel. Now it's obligated in separating trumot. I now change my mind and I say, actually, I don't want to eat it like that. I want to eat it right as a snack. Well, it's already, the obligation for tevel is already kicked in, and therefore you would still have to separate truma. So even according to Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda, there is a case whereby I need to separate my truma on Yom Tov. So everybody agrees. So how can the Mishnah say it is not? So says the Gemara, Ela my truma, rov truma. Says okay, we admit it's not every single case, not 100% of cases where you couldn't separate, but 99.9% of the time, when it comes to truma, the truma has to be separated before Yom Tov, and that principle still applies. There's a few crazy cases whereby you may have to separate it on Yom Tov itself. Okay, but the principle does not change, and therefore we still retain the inherent distinction between truma on the one hand and matanot kehuna and chala on the other. Jeffrey, did you have a question?
No, I was just wondering at which point in time it becomes tevel. Tevel is a situation where you haven't yet separated the truma. It's
Right.
tevel.
Right.
Yeah.
So
why would it be tevel if you've only done half of the process of converting it into fitting?
So again, the halacha is midoraita. The obligation for tevel to separate from the food is. Think about it like this. It's not that when any food is growing in the field or it's growing on a tree that immediately I have to separate truma. Right? It's only when I've harvested it and when I've processed it and when I've completed the process of harvesting that I have to separate. And for different foods, have a different stage in the process where that occurs. Right? Midrabanan said that the truth that midoraita before that point, I'm allowed to eat it. I'm allowed to eat whatever I want. Midrabanan said no, achilat keva you can't eat, only achilat arai. But that's the question over here is when you have this food and it's not going to be processed in the normal way, does that obligation still kick in or not? And that's essentially the machloket between Rabbi and Rabbi Yossi.
The intention was to bring. Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
The intention was to bring in the house to process it fully. So therefore, because the intention was to do that, it becomes tevel. Is that what it means?
In the last case, according to Rabbi Yossi, correct?
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Are there other cases where if you change your kavana, that the state does not change? Like in this case here?
It does change. It changes in the sense that the obligation to separate truma does not kick in at the Gemara. Well, it is at the Gemara Melacha, but what the Gemara Melacha is has changed, and therefore you would have to separate truma right now rather than waiting until the Meruach Bakri, because that's not going to take place.
Where's the baby?
In this case,
It says, all right.
You did a very good job, the baby. Very good job.
Okay.
Gave a wonderful share.
Masada. All right, we'll hold those questions and we'll continue then next week with Ras Hashem.
Shkoyach, thank you very much.
Good day, everyone. Shabbat shalom.
Shalom, Avara.